A millionaire asked a country girl to give birth to his child. But the girl's request shocked everyone. James Wheeler sat stiffly in the sterile white office of his oncologist, his well-tailored suit feeling suddenly constrictive. The room was quiet, save for the steady tick of a clock and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Across from him, Dr. Patel spoke in measured tones, her hands folded neatly on the desk. "The results confirm what we feared. It's advanced leukemia, Mr. Wheeler. At best, 6 months." The words hovered in the air, akin to an unexpected visitor. James nodded, his face impassive, but the grip of his hand on the armrest betrayed him. His knuckles whitened under the force. She kept talking about treatment options, quality of life, and palliative care, but the details blurred together, muffled by the ringing in his ears. 6 months. The elevator doors slid open to reveal James's penthouse, a masterpiece of modern design perched high above Manhattan. Glass walls framed a glittering skyline, a view that once fueled his pride. Now it felt distant, indifferent to the man who had built an empire beneath it. The echo of his leather shoes on the marble floor followed him as he made his way to the bar, pouring a generous glass of scotch. He didn't sip it. He stared at the amber liquid, his reflection fractured and distorted in its depths. He lowered himself onto the pristine white couch and let his gaze wander over the room. It was immaculate, like every aspect of his life, but devoid of warmth. Art pieces curated for their value, rather than meaning, adorned the walls. Shelves brimming with books and awards showcased his intellect, but they told no stories of laughter or companionship. The silence pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. He set the untouched glass down and leaned back, his head resting against the cool leather. His chest rose and fell in deliberate breaths, but no matter how deeply he inhaled, the air refused to feel clean. James closed his eyes, and for a moment, the facade crumbled. Regret seeped in, unbidden. The nights spent hunched over boardroom tables, the years sacrificed to quarterly profits, the birthdays forgotten, the friends faded into distant acquaintances. What had it all been for? At 40, a sprawling penthouse, a collection of bespoke suits, and a diagnosis rendered it all meaningless. Unbidden, his thoughts drifted to Bar Harbor, Maine. The salty breeze, the uneven cobblestones of the harbor town, and the old clapboard houses stood defiant against the Atlantic winds. It had been years, decades really, since he last walked those streets. His life had stretched farther and farther from that quaint coastal town, leaving it a hazy memory tucked away like an old postcard. His hand reached for the drawer of the side table, the wood sliding smoothly against the runners. Inside lay the relics of a youth that felt like it belonged to someone else. A stack of photographs, a few crumpled ticket stubs, and an old yearbook with the faded gold lettering of Bar Harbor High School embossed on the cover. He lifted it gingerly, the weight of it heavier than he remembered. The leather binding, once firm, had softened with age. Flipping through the pages, he found himself staring into the earnest faces of his classmates. Names and smiles floated back into his memory, though some remained frustratingly out of reach. Then he saw her. Miss Thompson. The page captured her face in crisp black and white, her smile radiating kindness. Beneath it, the caption read, "Shaping the future, one mind at a time." James lingered on her image, a mix of gratitude and shame swelling in his chest. She had seen something in him, a raw potential he hadn't yet understood in himself. It was she who stayed after class to tutor him, who loaned him books that expanded his world, who dipped into her own modest savings to cover his application fees for college when he couldn't afford them. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft yet firm. "You can be extraordinary, James. Don't waste it." But he had wasted something, hadn't he? It wasn't his ambition that he had wasted, but rather the bonds that bound him to a life beyond success. He intended to come back, express his gratitude, and reassure her that her faith had not been misguided. Instead, he'd let the years slip by, filling them with meetings, mergers, and deals, until there was no room left for the simple act of gratitude. The yearbook lay open on his lap, and his gaze drifted to the skyline beyond the glass walls. Somewhere in that expanse of memory and salt air was a life he had left behind, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to go back. For the first time that day, his breathing slowed, the edges of his tension softening. He closed the yearbook and set it aside with a strange sense of resolve. Bar Harbor waited, holding pieces of his story that he hadn't yet written. Perhaps they were pieces he hadn't yet corrected. As James packed a small suitcase, the yearbook rested on top of his carefully folded shirts. It was time to go home. The road to Bar Harbor wound like an old memory, familiar but faint, flanked by towering pines that whispered in the coastal breeze. The sedan hummed beneath James Wheeler's steady grip on the wheel, its sleek exterior at odds with the rugged charm of the surroundings. The air was different here, cleaner, crisper, tinged with salt and the faint musk of earth after rain. It felt alive in a way New York had never managed. Bar Harbor emerged as the road descended toward the coastline. The town was smaller than he remembered, its pace slower, almost drowsy. Brightly painted storefronts stood like guardians of an era that had somehow resisted the relentless march of time. A few newer buildings punctuated the streets, their edges too sharp, their designs too modern, as though they had wandered into the wrong painting. James parked near the town square, stepping out to the creak of the driver's door. The sea breeze hit him first, followed by the distant cry of gulls and the faint clang of a buoy out in the bay. He stood there for a moment, letting the sounds and smells sink in. Bar Harbor was still itself, even after all these years. But he wasn't. The coffee shop on the corner hadn't changed, except for a new coat of paint on the sign. He could almost see his younger self through the window, hunched over a dog-eared textbook with a cup of coffee Miss Thompson insisted on paying for. Fuel for the future, she had called it with a smile. Back then, he had mocked her optimism. But now, the remembrance of her quiet faith resonated deeply within him. James walked toward the square. The pavement beneath his shoes was uneven, cracked in places, but it led him to the same old fountain, a modest stone structure draped in ivy. He paused, leaning on the worn edge, and let his gaze drift to the lighthouse on the far horizon. Its silhouette stood stark against the deepening afternoon sky, steadfast and unchanging, just as it had been when he was a boy. Miss Thompson had loved that lighthouse. "It's a symbol of persistence, James," she had said during one of their long walks after school. "It stands through storms, through darkness, always shining for those who need it." He had laughed at her sentimentality then. But now, he found himself gripping the edge of the fountain tighter, as if to anchor himself. The sharp smell of brine and the ache in his chest mingled with her voice in his mind, reminding him of how he had let her slip away. Years had passed since their last conversation. He had promised to visit, to write, but life had intervened with its relentless demands. He obsessed over success, ignoring the people who made it possible. James straightened and began walking toward the residential streets. Each step was heavier than the last as he rehearsed what he might say. The houses grew quieter, set back from the road with wide porches and well-kept gardens. When he turned onto her street, he hesitated. Her house was near the end of the lane, just as he remembered, a small white clapboard home with blue shutters. It looked unchanged, like a photograph in an old album, except for the flower beds. The flower beds had become overgrown, with wild tangles of green replacing the riot of blooms. The sight unsettled him. Miss Thompson had always taken pride in her garden, her hands dirt-streaked, but her smile radiant as she showed him how to plant marigolds or prune roses. He quickened his pace, his breath shallow, the pulse in his ears drowning out the soft rustle of leaves. When he reached the gate, it groaned under his hand as he pushed it open. The cracked path to the porch bore witness to the quiet invasion of time, with weeds sprouting between the stones. James stepped onto the porch, his polished shoes foreign against the creaking planks. He knocked softly, then again, his knuckles grazing the wood with growing urgency. No answer. The house appeared to pause for a moment. He tried the doorbell and heard its faint chime echo inside. Still nothing. His gaze swept over the windows, their curtains drawn tight. The stillness pressed against him, a weight in his chest that was harder to ignore than the leukemia. "Miss Thompson?" His voice cracked slightly, swallowed by the silence. He stepped back, his foot catching on a stray vine that had crept across the porch. James steadied himself and scanned the house again, his mind racing through possibilities. She was older now, much older. Maybe she was resting. Maybe she had moved to a care facility. But the wild garden whispered a harsher truth. And James, for all his carefully constructed confidence, didn't have the strength to knock again. The late afternoon sun had shifted, casting golden light on the peeling blue shutters of Miss Thompson's house. Knocking felt intrusive, but before he could question his actions, the stillness gnawed at him. Before he could turn away, the faint creak of the door startled him. It opened just enough to reveal a young woman, her dark hair tied back loosely, strands escaping to frame her face. Her eyes, sharp and guarded, met his. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but distant. James cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say. "I'm looking for Miss Thompson," he began, the words coming awkwardly. I used to be one of her students." The woman's posture softened slightly, but her expression remained unreadable. "You must be James Wheeler," she said, after a pause, her voice quieter now. James blinked. "Yes, that's me. How did you—" "She mentioned you. More than once." The door opened a bit wider, and she stepped onto the porch. She wore a faded cardigan and jeans, her sneakers scuffed from wear. There was a tiredness in the way she moved, like someone carrying an invisible weight. "Miss Thompson, is she home?" James inquired, feeling a sense of hollowness in the face of the overgrown garden and neglected house. The woman looked down briefly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "She passed away a few months ago." The words struck James hard in his chest. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence stretched until the woman spoke again. "I'm Laura, her daughter." The revelation jarred him. He had never known Miss Thompson had a child. She had always been so entirely devoted to her students, to her role as an educator, that her personal life had seemed like a faraway mystery. James started, but his voice broke. He swallowed and tried again. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." Laura gave a small nod, folding her arms as the breeze picked up. "It was cancer," she said simply. "By the time they caught it, it was too late." James stared at the floorboards, the cracks in the wood somehow mirroring the fissures in his chest. The guilt clawed its way up, sharp and unrelenting. He had let too many years pass, too many unspoken words. "She was proud of you, you know," Laura said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was softer now, tinged with something he couldn't quite place. "She kept a newspaper clipping about your first big deal. Showed it to everyone who would listen." James let out a bitter laugh, more a reflex than an emotion. She deserved more than that. I should have... He cut himself off, shaking his head. I should have visited. Laura watched him for a moment, her gaze no longer guarded, but tinged with curiosity. It's simple to lose track of things, she said. Life gets loud. He looked up at her, surprised by the understanding in her tone. Still, he said, his voice low, it doesn't excuse forgetting the people who made it possible. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The faint sound of waves crashing against the shore filled the silence between them. Would you like to come in? Laura asked finally. Her voice had softened, the edges smoothed out by something close to compassion. James hesitated, then nodded. If you don't mind. The house smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the kind of scent that spoke of a home lived in, but not tended to recently. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn and familiar, and the walls bore framed photographs of students, some young, some now adults. James spotted himself in one, standing awkwardly at the edge of a group shot. She kept everything, Laura said, catching his gaze. Every note, every picture. James moved toward the small dining table, cluttered with papers and knitting supplies. It feels like her, he said quietly. Laura leaned against the counter, her arms crossed loosely. She never stopped teaching, she said. Even when she got sick, she always said it gave her a reason to keep going. James nodded, though the knot in his chest tightened. She gave so much of herself, he said, to people like me. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. It's why I stayed, she said. When she fell ill, I remained by her side. She gave me everything, so it only felt right to give back. James turned to her, the weight of her words settling in. You stayed. She shrugged, though her posture betrayed the strain. I was in college. I had to drop out of college. The bills didn't pay themselves. She gestured to a framed photo of Miss Thompson on the mantel. She never wanted me to, but what else could I do? James felt a pang of admiration mingled with sorrow. Laura's resilience mirrored her mother's, and yet the weariness in her eyes betrayed the cost. I'm sorry, he said again, the words feeling inadequate. Laura offered a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. You're here now, she said simply. James stared at her, wondering what he could possibly offer to repay the debt that stretched beyond years. The kettle on the stove began to whistle softly, the sound punctuating the quiet of the room. Laura moved to turn it off, her steps deliberate but unhurried, as though the act itself was enough to fill the silence. James sat at the dining table, his hands clasped loosely together, his gaze wandering to the photos lining the wall. She used to sit right there, Laura said, setting two mismatched mugs on the table. She spent every evening with her tea and the book she had been reading that week. I'd ask her why she didn't try audiobooks, make things easier on her eyes, but she said it wasn't the same. She offered him one of the mugs. Chamomile, it's what we always had. Thank you, James said, his voice low. He lifted the mug, the heat against his palms grounding him. I can imagine her here. It feels like her. Laura nodded but didn't sit. She leaned against the counter, her arms folded tightly across her chest. It hasn't been the same since she's gone. I keep thinking I'll hear her calling my name, asking where I left her glasses. His knees buckled, and Laura caught him, her strength surprising against his weight. Stay with me, okay? Stay with me. Laura's voice was calm, but her urgency was unmistakable. She reached for the phone on the counter, balancing James against her as she dialed. I need an ambulance. Now. The minutes that followed were a blur of labored breaths and Laura's voice, grounding him. pulling him from the brink of unconsciousness. When the paramedics arrived, Laura stepped aside, her face pale but resolute as she gave them the details. At the hospital, the antiseptic smell and beeping monitors pulled James back to the surface. He opened his eyes to see Laura sitting in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked up as he stirred, her relief evident, but restrained. "You're awake," she said, standing and moving to his bedside. "The doctors said it was a complication from your condition. You didn't mention you were—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You scared me." Despite his exhaustion, James managed a faint smile. "It's not something I've had much practice talking about." Laura hesitated, then nodded. "Well, you should start. Individuals cannot provide assistance if they lack knowledge." The simplicity of her words struck him. "You remind me of her, you know," he said after a moment. Laura blinked, surprised. "My mother?" He nodded. "The way you handled everything impressed me. It's amazing how you maintained your composure despite what must have been a terrifying situation." He paused. "She always put others first. I see that in you." Laura looked away, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I didn't do anything special, just what needed to be done." "That's exactly what makes it special," James replied, his voice quiet but steady. The conversation lulled, and James allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Laura, I owe your mother a debt I can't repay. And now I owe you too." Laura opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I can't change the past, but I can do something now. Come to New York, work at my company. You shouldn't have to carry everything on your own." Laura's eyes widened. James, I don't know. That's a lot." "I know it's a lot," he said, his voice softening. "But you deserve a chance to build something for yourself. Your mother would have wanted that." Laura hesitated, the weight of the offer settling over her. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained wary. "I'll think about it." James gave her a warm smile. "That's all I ask." As Laura stepped out to give him space to rest, James closed his eyes, the steady beeping of the monitor a reminder of the time he had left. He thought of Miss Thompson and her unwavering belief in him, and now, her daughter. Somehow, through the fractures of loss and illness, a new thread of purpose had begun to weave itself into his life. The city stretched endlessly around her, a cacophony of lights, sounds, and motion that seemed to vibrate with a life all its own. Laura stood on the sidewalk outside her new apartment, clutching her small suitcase. The building loomed above her, a sleek tower of glass and steel that caught the sunlight like a mirror, throwing it back in dazzling shards. It was everything Bar Harbor wasn't: modern, cold, and intimidating. She hesitated before stepping inside, the weight of her decision pressing down like the suitcase she carried. It had taken her weeks to accept James's offer, weeks of lying awake in her childhood bedroom, listening to the silence that followed her mother's absence. Bar Harbor had grown lonelier with each passing day, the routines she clung to offering no solace. Ultimately, the opportunity to depart and begin anew had surpassed her anxieties. The apartment James arranged for her was immaculate. Hardwood floors stretched beneath her feet, and the windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. Everything was perfect, almost to the point of sterility. She ran her hand over the kitchen counter, its polished surface reflecting the fluorescent light above, and wondered how long it would take to feel like home. The first day at Wheeler Industries was no easier. Laura smoothed her blouse as she stepped into the elevator, the mirrored walls amplifying her nerves. She had expected stairs, But the whispers were harder to bear, colleagues with sharp suits and sharper tongues murmuring as she passed. "She's his charity case," one voice floated down the hallway. "I heard she's from some small town nowhere," another added, laced with disdain. Laura maintained her composure, yet the words persistently gnawed at her determination. The office was a maze of glass partitions and bustling professionals, each one moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. Every step Laura took echoed her doubts, making her feel like an imposter. James had arranged for her to start in a junior administrative role. It was a modest position, but the tasks were overwhelming. Schedules to coordinate, reports to organize, meetings to shadow. The pace was relentless, the expectations high, and the isolation suffocating. Weeks passed, and the city seemed no closer to welcoming her. Every day was a struggle to keep up, to navigate through the sea of unfamiliar faces and cold shoulders. But James noticed. One evening, as the office emptied, James appeared in her cubicle. His presence, though quiet, filled the space. "You're still here," he said, his tone light but curious. Laura glanced up from her computer, exhaustion etched in her features. "Just trying to keep up." He leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You're doing more than keeping up. Don't let them make you think otherwise." She hesitated, then sighed. "It's not just the work. It's everything. The city and its inhabitants are truly remarkable. It's also big." James smiled faintly. "It is. But it doesn't stay that way. You find your rhythm, and it gets smaller." She studied him, unsure how to respond. He seemed tired, the lines on his face deeper, but his eyes held something steady, something certain. "How did you do it?" she asked. He exhaled, looking out the window. "I didn't have a choice. The hunger to prove myself was bigger than the fear. But I had help. People who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." His gaze shifted back to her. "Like your mother." The mention of her mother tightened Laura's throat, but she nodded. "I just don't want to let you down." "You won't," James said simply. "And if you ever feel like you might, come to me. I'll help." Over the following weeks, James made true on his promise. Their conversations shifted from casual to instructional. He introduced her to the basics of business strategy, management, and negotiation, weaving his decades of experience into lessons tailored for her. His patience surprised her. He explained everything with care, ensuring she understood not just the how, but the why. One afternoon, as they sat in his office reviewing a report, James hesitated, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. "Laura," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "there's something I need to tell you." She set the report down, her attention sharpening. "What is it?" He took a breath, the weight of it visible. "My illness has progressed. I don't have much time." The words struck her abruptly and relentlessly. She stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. "How long?" she managed. 6 months if I'm lucky." Despite his matter-of-fact tone, the vulnerability in his eyes revealed the effort it took to utter the words. Laura's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt inadequate. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want it to color everything," James replied. "I wanted you to come here for you, not because you felt obligated." Laura looked at him, her emotions tangled. "What can I do?" she asked softly. James's smile was faint, but genuine. "Just keep going, learn, grow. That's more than enough." And in that moment, Laura felt the weight of his trust. She nodded, her resolve solidifying. "I will." James nodded, satisfied. The city outside buzzed on, indifferent to the quiet moment of connection inside. But for Laura, It marked the beginning of something steady, a determination to rise, not just for herself, but for the man who had believed in her. The air in James's office was unusually still, muffled by the soft hum of the city outside. Laura sat across from him, her notepad in hand, as they reviewed the financial summary of the quarter. The conversation was routine, numbers and projections, problems and solutions, but James's demeanor seemed different. His usual focus wavered, and his responses were slower and measured. When the discussion lulled, James folded his hands on the desk and looked directly at Laura. The intensity of his gaze took her by surprise. "Laura," he began, his voice calm but deliberate, "I've been thinking about the future. Or rather, what happens after I'm gone." Laura frowned, lowering her notepad. "James, you don't need to talk about this now." "I do," he interrupted gently. He explained, "It's because I don't have much time anymore." She shut her mouth, his words weighing heavily on her chest. James leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "There's something I want to ask of you," he said finally. "And I know it's unconventional." Laura sat straighter, wary but curious. "What is it?" James hesitated, searching for the right words. "I want you to have a child, my child, through artificial insemination." Does this strange story make you excited and want to know the ending? Leave a comment, apple pie, so we can send you a warm greeting. The room fell silent, save for the distant wail of a siren somewhere far below. Laura blinked, certain she'd misheard. But James's expression was steady, his gaze unwavering. "I know how it sounds," he continued, his voice softer now. "But hear me out. I've spent my life building this company and legacy, and I have no heir. I have no family, no one to continue the work I've put in. And then there's you." "Me," Laura's voice echoed, barely a whisper above the others. "Yes," James said firmly. "You have your mother's strength, her integrity, her heart. You've shown me that over and over again. If anyone could raise a child to inherit what I've built, not just the wealth, but the values that matter, it's you." Laura's mind spun. The proposition was surreal, almost absurd, and yet James's sincerity was undeniable. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Finally, she managed, "James, that's a lot to ask." "I know," he said quietly. "And if I didn't believe you could do it, I wouldn't ask." The enormity of the request settled over her, heavy and disorienting. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices she'd made, and of her own struggles to adapt to this new life. Could she take on something this monumental? Was it even right to try? "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What you're asking, it's not just a decision for now, it's forever." James nodded, his gaze steady. "I don't expect you to answer right away. Take the time you need. Think about it." Laura stood, needing space, needing air. She crossed the room to the window, the city sprawling below like an alien world. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, uncertain and conflicted. She thought of her mother again, of her unwavering belief in doing what was right, even when it was hard. "What would this mean?" she asked, her voice softer now. "For the child. For me." James leaned forward, his tone earnest. "It implies complete support in all aspects. Financially, emotionally. I'd teach you everything I know to ensure you're prepared. And the child would inherit everything. Not just the company, but the principles your mother and you have lived by." Laura turned back to face him. "And what about me? Would I just be a surrogate to you?" "No," James said firmly. "You'd be a mother. Their mother." She took a deep breath. "I'll do it," she said, "but I have conditions." James set down his pen, giving her his full attention. Of course. I want to play an active role in raising the child, she said firmly. I won't just hand them over. I need you to teach me everything. About the company, about your vision, about the world you've built. If I'm going to do this, I need to be ready. James smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him in days. I wouldn't have it any other way. Laura's initial months of pregnancy were filled with uncertainty and quiet determination. Although she had made the decision, the reality of her new role proved to be more challenging than she had anticipated. James, true to his word, ensured she wanted for nothing, arranging for a doctor, a private nurse, and even prenatal yoga classes. Yet, no amount of material comfort could shield her from the scrutiny that followed her every step. The whispers started the moment the news spread through James's social circle. The man with no heir, no family, had suddenly chosen her, a girl from a small town with no pedigree, no connections. At first it was subtle, a lingering glance during meetings, a raised eyebrow at a restaurant, but the subtlety soon gave way to outright disdain. She's just using him, Rebecca, James's housekeeper, said one morning, her voice sharp as she wiped down the kitchen counters. Laura, seated at the breakfast table, froze mid-sip of her tea. She had grown accustomed to Rebecca's pointed remarks, but hadn't expected such brazenness. "Excuse me," Laura apologized, carefully placing her mug down. Rebecca didn't look up. "You heard me. It's obvious. He's vulnerable, and you're taking advantage. I've seen it before." Laura's stomach churned, not just from the nausea that had plagued her mornings. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Rebecca finally met her gaze, her eyes cold. "I know enough. People like you, small-town girls looking for a big-city payday, always have an angle." Before Laura could respond, James entered the room. His presence was a relief, though his expression darkened as he caught the tension. "Rebecca," James said, his tone low and firm. "A word." The housekeeper stiffened but followed him out of the room. Laura heard murmured voices from the hallway, James's calm yet authoritative tone cutting through Rebecca's protests. Moments later, Rebecca returned, her face stony, and resumed her work in silence. James sat across from Laura, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about that. She's protective in her way." But she was out of line. "It's fine," Laura lied. "I can handle it." James leaned forward, his eyes steady. "You shouldn't have to. You're doing something extraordinary, Laura, and you deserve respect for it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." That evening, the weight of James's words carried Laura through the glittering halls of a charity gala, where the next trial awaited. James had insisted she join him, despite her protests that she wasn't ready for the public scrutiny. The room was filled with sharp suits and designer gowns, the air thick with polished smiles and half-meant compliments. Laura stayed close to James, her hand resting lightly on his arm, but the whispers followed her like shadows. "She's just a nobody," one woman said, her voice carrying over the clinking of champagne glasses. "Can you believe he's actually letting her carry his child?" Another laughed softly. "He must be desperate." Laura's chest tightened, the room suddenly feeling too small, too loud. She excused herself and retreated to the balcony, where the cool night air welcomed her like a familiar companion. She gripped the railing, willing herself to breathe. She didn't hear James approach until he was beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You shouldn't let them drive you away," he said quietly. "I'm not running," Laura replied, though her voice wavered. "I just needed space." James studied her, his expression unreadable. "They don't know you. They don't see what I see." Laura looked at him, her frustration spilling over. "And what do you see, James? Because right now, all I see is someone out of place in a world that doesn't want her." James's expression softened. "I see someone who's braver than she realizes. Someone who's willing to do something incredible, even when it scares her." He paused. "You remind me of your mother." The mention of her mother brought tears to Laura's eyes, but she blinked them away. She wouldn't have let them get to her, she said quietly. "No, she wouldn't," James agreed. "And neither will you. Your strength surpasses your own perceptions, Laura. Furthermore, the actions we take, including yours, hold significance." Laura nodded slowly, his words settling like a weight in her chest, heavy but grounding. She turned back to the city lights, her grip on the railing loosening. "Thank you," she said softly. James smiled, a small but genuine curve of his lips. "Always." The weeks that followed were no easier, but Laura carried James's words with her, a quiet resilience growing within her. The whispers didn't stop, but she learned to drown them out, focusing instead on the child she was bringing into the world and the legacy she was helping to build. And through it all, James stood beside her, a constant reminder of the strength she had always possessed, but never truly believed. The winter sun filtered weakly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James's penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Laura sat at the dining table, a cup of tea warming her hands as James adjusted the whiteboard he had set up in the living room. It was an incongruous sight, this makeshift classroom in the middle of his opulent apartment, but James insisted that visualizing ideas was critical to learning. "You've got to understand," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "that building a business isn't just about numbers or profit margins. It's about people, how to lead them, how to inspire them. That's what makes a legacy endure." Laura nodded, her focus unwavering despite the weight she carried, both figuratively and literally. Her pregnancy had reached its 4th month, and she was beginning to feel the strain. However, James's unwavering determination was contagious, and she eagerly soaked up his lessons. He spoke with the urgency of a man racing against time, every word deliberate and heavy with meaning. "Why is transparency so important?" he inquired, pointing to a list of management principles he had inscribed on the board. Laura thought for a moment before answering. "People must have faith in you. If they don't trust you, they won't follow you." James smiled faintly. "Good. But it's more than that. Building trust means giving people the confidence to act on their own, not just following you. A successful leader doesn't create followers. They create leaders." Laura jotted the words down in her notebook, feeling the gravity of the lesson. She looked up at James, noticing how pale he seemed, the dark circles under his eyes more pronounced than usual. His health was deteriorating, but he refused to let it slow him down. Later that evening, James and Laura sat in the den, a fire crackling in the hearth. The room was quieter now, the lessons for the day over. Laura reclined slightly, her hand resting on her rounded belly. James leaned forward in his chair, his gaze softening as he watched her. "Have you thought about names?" he asked suddenly. Laura blinked, surprised by the question. Not really. It feels too early." "It's never too early," James said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "This child is already a part of the world, a part of us." Laura hesitated, then placed her hand more firmly on her belly. "Do you have any ideas?" James tilted his head, considering. "Jackson," he said finally. "It was my grandfather's name. He was a stubborn old man, but he believed in hard work and doing right by others." "Jackson," Laura repeated, testing the sound. "It's strong." James's smile widened. It is. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire. Then, as if compelled, James moved to kneel in front of her. He placed a tentative hand on her belly, looking up at her for permission. Laura nodded, her throat tightening. "Hey, Jackson," James said softly, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it. "It's your dad. I may not have the opportunity to meet you, but I want you to know that I already love you. You are already loved beyond your wildest dreams. And I'm going to make sure you have everything you need to be great. Not just successful, but kind, strong, and brave." Laura felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. Watching James, she saw a side of him that few had likely ever seen. A man stripped of his ambition and status, speaking with nothing but pure love and hope. The following weeks passed in a blur of lessons and quiet moments. James taught Laura about the company's inner workings, how to read financial reports, negotiate contracts, and identify growth opportunities. But he also shared stories from his past, memories of his struggles and triumphs, each one a window into the values he hoped to pass on. "You don't need to know everything," he told her one afternoon as they sat reviewing a business case. "You just need to know how to find the right people who do." Laura nodded, committing the advice to memory. Despite her growing confidence, there were still moments of doubt, times when she felt overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead. But James was always there to steady her, his unwavering belief in her capabilities a constant source of strength. One evening, as the city lights twinkled outside, Laura found James sitting alone in the den, a blanket draped over his shoulders. He looked fragile, smaller somehow, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Why are you still up?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I was thinking about Jackson," he said, his voice quiet. "About all the things I won't be here to teach him." Laura reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You've already taught him so much. Through me." James looked at her, his expression a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I just want him to know that everything I did was for him, and for you." Laura swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it difficult to speak. "He'll know. I promise." As the night deepened, they sat together in the quiet, two people bound by a shared purpose and the fleeting time they had left. And in that moment, despite the shadows looming over them, there was a sense of peace. The days grew shorter as winter settled over the city, its icy grip mirrored in James's declining health. The once robust man who had guided Laura through financial reports and management strategies now spent most of his time in the den, wrapped in blankets, his movements slow and deliberate. His voice, once commanding, had softened, but the sharpness of his mind and the warmth of his spirit remained undimmed. James was determined to spend his final days at home, not in the sterile confines of a hospital. "This is where I belong," he had told Laura. "Here, with you, preparing for Jackson's future." Laura honored his wishes, transforming the penthouse into a place of quiet comfort. The den became their sanctuary, a fire always crackling in the hearth, books stacked on every available surface, and soft music playing in the background. Despite the looming inevitability of his condition, they created a rhythm to their days, filled with small routines and meaningful conversations. One evening, Laura entered the den carrying a tray with soup and tea. James sat in his armchair, gazing out the window at the twinkling city lights, the glow reflected in his eyes, which seemed both distant and present. "Dinner," she announced softly, setting the tray on the side table. James turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're spoiling me." "You deserve it," she replied, pulling a chair closer to his. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," he admitted, his voice raspier than usual. but grateful. Laura hesitated, her hand resting on her belly. Grateful for what? James reached for her hand, his grip weaker than it had been, but steady enough. For you. For Jackson. For the chance to leave something meaningful behind. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to stay strong. You've given me more than I could have ever imagined, she said. Your faith in me. It's changed everything. James chuckled lightly. It wasn't faith, Laura. It was recognition. You had everything you needed all along. I just gave you a little push. Laura looked at him, her throat tightening. You've taught me so much, James. About business, about resilience, about love. His smile softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing for a moment. Then I've done my job. As the days passed, James's strength waned further. Laura stayed by his side, reading to him when his voice grew too weak, sharing stories of her childhood, and imagining the future they were building for Jackson. James often placed his hand on her belly, a faint smile crossing his face as he felt the gentle kicks of the life within. Strong, he whispered one evening, his hand lingering. Just like his mother. Laura didn't correct him, though she knew the child would carry much of James's spirit, too. Instead, she held his hand, cherishing the connection between them. The final night was quiet, almost serene. The city outside buzzed with life, unaware of the stillness within the penthouse. Laura sat beside James's bed, her hand resting in his as he drifted in and out of sleep. His breathing was shallow but steady, his expression peaceful. Laura, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I'm here, she said, leaning closer. Promise me, he said, his eyes fluttering open. Promise me you'll keep going. For Jackson, for yourself. I promise, she said firmly, though her voice wavered. You don't have to worry about us. We'll be okay. James's lips curved into a faint smile. You'll be more than okay. You'll be extraordinary. His eyes closed again, his grip on her hand loosening. Laura sat with him through the night, her heart heavy but filled with gratitude for the time they had shared. As the first rays of dawn broke through the window, James's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. He passed peacefully, his face serene, as if he had simply fallen into a deep and restful sleep. The silence that followed was profound, wrapping the penthouse in a cocoon of stillness. Laura pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the life that continued within her, and allowed herself to grieve. Both for the man she lost and for their journey, tears fell freely. But beneath the sorrow was a quiet resolve. James had left her with more than memories. He had left her with purpose. As the city awoke to a new day, Laura wiped her tears and whispered softly, We'll make you proud, I promise. And with that, she rose, ready to carry forward the legacy James had entrusted to her, for herself, for Jackson, and for the man who had taught her the true meaning of strength and love. The cry of a newborn echoed through the sterile, whitewashed walls of the hospital room. Laura lay exhausted, but overwhelmed by an indescribable joy, her eyes fixed on the tiny, wriggling boy nestled in her arms. He scrunched his face against the cold, his lungs testing their strength in the world for the first time. Jackson, Laura whispered, her voice hoarse yet tender. The name felt like a promise fulfilled, a bridge between the past and the future. She stroked his soft cheek, marveling at the warmth of his small body against her chest. The nurse, standing nearby, smiled softly. He's beautiful, she said. Congratulations. Laura nodded, tears blurring her vision. Thank you, she murmured. She pressed her lips to Jackson's forehead, inhaling the clean, sweet scent of his skin. Welcome to the world, little one. But as joy flooded her heart, so did a pang of bittersweet longing. She glanced toward the window, where the afternoon sunlight streamed in. She imagined James there, sitting in the corner with his wry smile, his hand resting on his cane as he watched with quiet pride. He had wanted this moment so badly, had dreamed of meeting Jackson, holding him, teaching him. Now, he was no longer present. Sleepless nights and small victories filled the weeks following Jackson's birth. Laura's days were filled with feedings, diaper changes, and moments of awe as she discovered the tiny details of her son's existence, his tiny hands grasping hers, the way his dark eyes seemed to study her with unspoken trust. But amidst the joy of motherhood was the shadow of responsibility. Alongside Jackson, Laura had inherited James's company and his legacy. The weight of it felt enormous, a task too difficult for someone who still felt like an outsider in the polished world of corporate power. The first major challenge came only a month after Jackson's birth. A key investor, skeptical of Laura's ability to lead, had threatened to withdraw. The news had arrived in the middle of the night, a curt email that sent Laura spiraling into self-doubt. Seated at her kitchen table with Jackson asleep in a bassinet nearby, she reread the email, the words blurring together. Inexperienced, unqualified, risky. The investor hadn't said it outright, but the message was clear. They didn't trust her. They didn't trust her ideas, her leadership, or her worth. She buried her face in her hands, her exhaustion catching up with her. How could she possibly do this? How could she balance the demands of motherhood and leadership while honoring James's legacy? The thought of failure loomed over her, sharp and unrelenting. But then she remembered James's voice, calm and steady in her mind. "You're stronger than you think. You just have to believe it." Laura straightened, her breath steadying. James had trusted her even when she hadn't trusted herself. He had seen something in her, something worth nurturing. And now she had to find that strength for Jackson, for herself, and for the man who had believed in her. The following morning, Laura arrived at Wheeler Industries with Jackson in tow. The staff, accustomed to James's commanding presence, watched with curiosity as Laura entered the conference room, the baby carrier balanced on her arm. She set Jackson down gently before turning to face the board members and the skeptical investor. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I know some of you have doubts about my ability to lead. I won't deny that I'm new to this. However, I've dedicated the past year to learning from the most experienced individual, someone who founded this company from its inception, dedicating his entire being to its success. And I intend to honor that legacy." She paused, glancing at Jackson, who stirred but remained asleep. "This isn't just about numbers or profits. It's about people." James believed in building trust and in creating a team of leaders who could carry on his vision. "That's what I'm here to do." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the group. The investor who had doubted her shifted in his seat, his expression thoughtful. Laura didn't falter. She outlined her plans for the company's next quarter, presenting strategies James had taught her, interwoven with her own ideas. By the end of the meeting, she had earned cautious nods from the board and a handshake from the investor. As she exited the conference room, with Jackson now awake and gurgling happily, Laura experienced an unexpected surge of confidence. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading. That evening, Laura sat by Jackson's crib, watching as he slept peacefully. The city lights glowed faintly through the curtains, a reminder of the world waiting outside. She reached for the locket she wore around her neck, a gift from James before he passed. Inside was a simple engraving, strength, love, legacy. I hope I'm making you proud, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jackson stirred, his tiny hand reaching out in his sleep, and Laura smiled. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But she also knew she had the strength to face them. James had given her the tools, the belief, and the purpose. And now, as she cradled her son, Laura felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. This was her new beginning, a journey she would take for herself, for Jackson, and for the legacy James had entrusted to her. Spring arrived with the soft blush of cherry blossoms blooming across the city, their delicate petals a reminder of renewal and resilience. 6 months had passed since Jackson's birth, and Laura found herself balancing the demands of motherhood with the responsibilities of James's legacy. Every step she took was both a tribute to him and a test of her own strength. Sitting at her desk in the office, she reviewed the final documents for the James Wheeler Foundation, the culmination of months of planning. The foundation was her vision, a beacon of hope for leukemia patients and their families, offering not only financial assistance, but also emotional and logistical support. It was the perfect reflection of James's compassion, a legacy that embodied his belief in the power of helping others. The foundation's mission statement rested on the first page of the documents, a simple yet powerful message: strength, love, legacy. Laura ran her fingers over the words, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She was determined to carry forward James's life, which transcended mere words. "Ready, Miss Thompson?" her assistant asked, stepping into the office. Laura stood, adjusting her blazer. She glanced at the years-old picture of James on her desk, his confident smile captured in the glow of success, and nodded. "Yes, let's do this." The foundation held its launch event in a bright open atrium, adorned with greenery and photos of James. Each image told a story: James shaking hands with employees, James speaking at a charity gala, James at the peak of his career, always with a look of quiet determination. Laura stood at the podium, Jackson cradled in her arms. The room was filled with donors, journalists, and supporters, their attention focused on her. When James Wheeler spoke about legacy, he wasn't talking about wealth or power, she began, her voice steady despite the weight of emotion in her chest. He was talking about people. He was discussing the importance of leaving the world in a better state than when you found it, about giving others the strength to rise above their circumstances. She paused, glancing down at Jackson, who blinked up at her with wide, curious eyes. This foundation is a reflection of that vision. It's here to ensure that no family faces the challenges of leukemia alone. It's here to carry forward the compassion and hope that James lived by. The thunderous applause followed, and for a moment, Laura allowed herself to feel pride, not for herself, but for the man whose legacy she felt honored to protect. A week later, Laura returned to Bar Harbor for the first time in over a year. The coastal town was unchanged, its rhythm as gentle and steady as the tides that lapped at its shores. She parked in front of her mum's old house, its white clapboard exterior weathered but familiar. Jackson cooed softly from his car seat as Laura carried him up the porch steps. Laura had tended to the once overgrown garden during her absence. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of the house. Laura sat on the porch swing, holding Jackson close as she looked out at the lighthouse in the distance. Its steady beam cut through the fading light of dusk, a reminder of the persistence James had so admired. "This is where it all started," she said softly, her voice carrying into the stillness. "Your grandmother believed in me before I even believed in myself. And James, he saw something in me that I'm still trying to see." Jackson gurgled in response, his tiny hand clutching at her finger. Laura smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I promise you this, Jackson," she continued. "I'll raise you with the strength and love they both believed in. I'll show you what it means to leave the world better than you found it. I'll ensure that you understand the depth of our love for you." As the stars began to appear in the sky, Laura closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her. Of Miss Thompson's gentle guidance, of James's unwavering belief in her, and of the journey that had brought her to this moment. She wasn't the same woman who had sat on this porch years ago, uncertain and afraid. She was stronger now, surer of her purpose. The lighthouse's beam swept across the horizon, steady and unyielding, as if offering its quiet encouragement. Laura held Jackson close, the cool night air brushing against her cheeks. She whispered into the stillness, her words both a promise and a prayer. "We'll make you proud." And with that, the journey continued, not as an ending, but as a new beginning, filled with hope, strength, and the unbreakable bond of love. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.